to start, we're going to start off with our zero trust. So those of you who have been here before know that we're a huge believer in zero trust, as you should be, as anyone, especially with upcoming conflicts in the world going on. Please, for the love of God, make an organization like this. All right, zero trust. The entire idea being that we don't trust anyone, no matter what access or resource they're attempting to access. We want to know who they are, where they're coming from, what you're accessing. Basically, you become police on every access resource attempt that your entire organization attempts to do. Going through here, we have our users. Obviously, that's your identity kind of component of this, and pivoting off of that, you have your devices, applications, workload, data, network, orchestration, and analytics. Generally, user is going to be the main one you're going to want to pivot off of because it's the easiest place for most people to start. Most people start there with implementing things such as MFA. That's a good implementation aspect of the user pillar. But as you kind of go through each of these pillars, there's different things you can kind of do in terms of protecting your devices, your data, and your users. And that's kind of what we'll be going over, especially as it relates to mobile devices. So the interesting pillars that we're kind of covering today is devices and how you may or may not be using that pillar. And in some situations, how it's probably in your best interest not to, which can sound kind of odd, but I promise will make sense here shortly. Because the idea is if you cannot control based on this pillar, you can use the other pillars to provide at least a halfway decent solution to provide access within a zero trust model. That's what we'll kind of get into. So to define what each of these are, BYOD, as I'm sure everyone on this call will know, means bring your own device. Everyone should know that, but just for the definitions, it's to allow an organization to allow their users to bring their own device, such as smartphones, tablets, and laptops for work-related activity. This approach has gained significant traction since COVID, since everyone was kind of forced into remote work. And then as people are coming back and technologies continue to advance, BYOD is always becoming an issue. People either bringing their own machine, their own laptops, their own cell phones. Additionally, there's other concerns with legality, which we'll kind of get into. MDM stands for mobile device management. It's for deploying software solutions and allow organizations to monitor, manage, and secure mobile devices used within a work context. These solutions generally will provide a centralized way to enforce a security baseline with your policies, control access to corporate data, as well as manage apps on those devices, including at times personal devices. Now, there are risks to doing BYOD without an MDM, for example. You have no visibility in data securities, nothing really preventing anyone from, for example, grabbing all of your contact lists or any kind of sensitive information or PHI data and basically walking off with it. So that's what this kind of webinar is about, is how you can get better at controlling that and provide that kind of visibility. So that's MDM. Now, the main benefits of MDM obviously are improved security, your compliance and regulatory adherence, and seamless IT management of it. Benefits of the BYODs, your increased employee productivity, cost savings for organizations. You're not having to buy devices for everyone, and employee satisfaction because they're not having to run around multiple devices. So how do you kind of marry all this up in a secure way? Well, that's where MAM comes in, and that's where different enrollment types come in. MAM, if you ever heard that as compared to MDM, is mobile application management. The idea being that if we, let me back up. Let me give you the technical definition first, and then I'll get to the practical application. Technical definition is that it is a subset for mobile device management that focuses specifically on managing and securing applications on a mobile device. So what does that actually mean? Well, what that means is that if you can't control the device in a zero trust model because it is, for example, BYOD, it could be coming in, what you can do as an alternative is to put walls around your application that's being used to prevent any type of data leakage, any kind of copy pasting to other solutions. While not actually forcing that device to be enrolled, because there are concerns around that. All right, so with those concerns, let's get into kind of the main pushbacks that we see from end users around MDMs. That would be your invasion of privacy. It's a common complaint, loss of control over personal devices. Many feel as soon as they're enrolled in MDM, you've now taken over their phone. The impact to the device's performance and batteries, obviously it has to check in. There's additional lookups. It's going to eat some battery. The user's experience itself, some of them are clean, some of them are not, and we'll kind of get into that in the enrollment types. Fear of data loss and wipe by the organization, that is 100% a very real thing that unfortunately not many people realize, but the vast majority of iOS, for example, MDM enrollments, the technical staff can wipe your entire phone, not just the company data. But we'll kind of get into the different enrollment types and if that is a concern, which ones to use. Job-related overreach and legal issues with working after hours, especially in places like California that have recently done a after hours legislation. That can get kind of interesting. Now, there's kind of workarounds you can get around that by basically just cutting off their access at certain hours using conditional access and whatnot that are a halfway decent approach to that. In terms of addressing these concerns with internal staff, because they do come up every time we have these conversations around zero trust and MDM, is how do you kind of broach your staff that you're not, digging through their phone. The core elements there in terms of forming your staff is to communicate transparency. You need to explain what data is and isn't monitored within the MDM solution and how the MDM or MAM policies would protect corporate information versus personal. You need to ensure privacy, such as implementing policies that respect personal data and limit management to work-related apps and data only. You also can offer flexibility, allowing them to either take a company device if they're not okay with those policies, or to be knocked down to a MAM policy with a BYOD. But basically, by offering some type of flexibility, you get a lot less pushback on the end users. Additionally, you also provide support. The end users are going to need your support. And lastly, build trust within your organization. Everyone here knows you should have some end users that act as your local heroes when deploying new security solutions, new software solutions, new anything. Be sure to use those. All right, so now we're going to get into kind of the dirty of it, the enrollment types and what to kind of be mindful of and how it all kind of works together. So these are our enrollment types. Now, this may seem quite extensive, and that is unfortunately because it is. However, it doesn't need to be. Because you can actually summarize this down into only a few different questions that kind of needed answers within your organization to know which one you should be using. I'm going to kind of go over the different types of enrollment that are possible, as well as kind of the limitations around them. So we're going to start with the iOS side. So your iOS is divided up into 3 different types of enrollment, including a BYOD option for iOS. I do want to point out iOS and Android handle this kind of stuff dramatically different. Dramatically different. Android has always been on the side of corporations or companies with open source, and Apple's always been on the side of the individual itself. And so they kind of structure the MDM policies around that. Also, some very little known dirty secret in the MDM world that no MDM provider can do things that the others can't because they're all limited by the same manufacturer. So there's not anything that one MDM can do that the other can't, since they're all limited by the actual producer of the operating system themselves. All right, so for iOS, you have a few different options here. Now, the questions you'll need to be asking yourself if you're going down the iOS or iPhone MDM enrollment pipeline is, what are you actually trying to accomplish? Because from the very deep and involved way of needing to factory reset every single device that you enroll so that you can get into supervised mode through DEP, for example, you would only ever really need to do that if you needed full control of the devices. They're company owned. You need to be able to pull GPS on that device. That's a good kind of barometer of, do I need supervised mode as it relates to iPhones? Is, do you need to be invasive on that iPhone? Because from an Android perspective, any enrolled device can pull the GPS coordinates of that device. On an iPhone, it cannot. It can only do so if it was made in if it has been provisioned in supervised mode. Now, the 2 ways to get in supervised mode are basically Apple configuration enrollment and automated device enrollment. Automated device enrollment will require you to have Apple Business Manager in place. Additionally, you'll need to factory reset your devices because they'll need to enroll during onboarding. The negatives of Apple configuration enrollment: you're going to need a USB cable, and you're going to need to reset them anyway. You can also get in supervised mode this way as well, but this is the last way you could potentially do it. The more common way is with this BYOD user and device enrollment. This allows your users to log in with a company credential and set aside part of that phone to be somewhat controlled. And Android does something very similar with their work profile that we'll kind of get into shortly. So you can either enroll based on the user identity or the device identity. And so, like everything though, there's a whole lot of gotchas involved in this. So for example, if you do user enrollment, you're going to need managed Apple IDs. If you're not familiar with managed Apple IDs, those are Apple IDs that are federated against another identity provider. It basically will create exclusions because as of right now, anyone can go create an Apple ID with a company name unless it's been federated. And so you get in a situation where you have hundreds, dozens of people who are using Apple IDs, using a company name. The company has no access to those accounts or to the management of them. So when you form managed Apple IDs and federate against it, everyone who has an Apple ID with that domain suffix, like plow.net, for example, is notified that their account's going to be changed and it'll be renamed because it's now been moved to a federated domain. So you'll need managed Apple IDs. Additionally, your work applications have to be deployed via VPP tokens. So it is a rather administratively taxing solution. But if you do have a hard requirement for MDM and you absolutely cannot touch those devices, then that route will work. The other route in this BYOD is device enrollment, which does not require managed Apple ID. However, there is one rather large caveat to that, and that is that the IT staff on the MDM side are able to wipe that entire phone. And I cannot stress that enough. It is BYOD, but it still will wipe that entire phone. And if you don't believe me, go wipe your phone because it will do it. There is a third option that's actually not on here. It's actually called account-driven user enrollment. It's very similar to user enrollment, but instead it uses the actual account itself to handle it instead of it being a needing to install applications for the onboarding. With a self-service one, the pros, being able to use it through self-service is great. IT staff are limited to controls, but again, you have to use managed IDs. And again, your work applications have to be deployed through the same VPP tokens. To summarize, for MDM, if you need absolute control and you're fine plugging into a wire, you can use Apple Configuration Enrollment, although generally you have to use another Mac for that. If you already have a Apple Business Manager instance or are willing to set one up, automated device enrollment is my high suggestion for company-owned devices because it will put them in supervised mode, as well as this is the equivalent of autopilot on the Mac side. So if you do have an issue with it, you can reset it and it will just come back up, automatically enroll back in your MDM management and bring it back into alignment. You may have noticed that the BYOD procedures for Apple kind of suck, and that's, well, because they do. They're just administratively a pain in the butt. If you have an absolute need for them, they work. It just takes a good bit of build out, especially if you're attempting to get the compliance data back from the device. That can get very hairy very quickly. Microsoft had some agreement with Jamf a while back that worked for a little while, but then they realized they needed a general third-party way, and now you have to use that, and the configuration of it is very annoying to say the least. So that's why we're kind of having this conversation, is I'm going to show you other ways you can still protect your data without having to potentially jump through all of this when you just have someone who wants to access their email. Android is a little bit easier. Well, I shouldn't say easier. Android's a little bit more forgiving in terms of enrollment. So Android enrollment's basically divided up into our BYOD, Android Enterprise with work profiles, our Android Enterprise dedicated devices, our Enterprise fully managed devices, Enterprise corporate owned work profile, which, truth be told, I've not seen a single person ever use that one. So let me know if you have seen anyone use that, and if so, what the use case was. And then Android open source project. That's an alternative to the Google managed version of Android Enterprise. There is another enrollment option called device administration that you won't see on this list. That is the legacy Android MDM enrollment. If you are using that, I would highly suggest going away from that. I have no idea when they're going to pull that out from Android support, but I know it is inevitable. All right, so within these are a little bit more loosey-goosey than your iOS side. So how do these actually work? Well, on the Android Enterprise personally owned device with a work profile, what they end up doing is going to your actual device and your phone, and they basically split it in half and create two profiles, a work and a personal. And so on your actual Android device, when you go to your app list, it'll say personal on the bottom and it'll say work on the bottom. If you pick work, there's all your work apps, and if you pick personal, it's all your personal apps. This works pretty well on BYOD. You can't cross that line depending on your policies. So if, for example, you want to copy data from one side to the other, you're unable to do that, as well as certain apps can communicate with others. And the enrollment of it is pretty straightforward. By that, I mean just installing a company portal, and you're pretty much off to the races if the policies are in place. Android dedicated devices. These are the ones that you generally use for your kiosk machines. So these are the ones that necessarily they are company owned, but not individual users will be using them. So they're your front desk kiosk, they're your signage on the wall. Those are great use cases for when to use Android Enterprise dedicated devices as your enrollment type, because you control the device fully, but they're generally locked into a single application or multi-kiosk mode. Android Enterprise fully managed. This is what you would generally use if you have Android devices that are fully controlled within your environment. And you need to know things like where they are GPS wise. This is the way to do that, because this pretty much grants you full access to that device. Obviously, you can't install any other MDMs. And obviously, this is a per user type setup. So you do have user tracking. But yeah, basically on your actual managed Android devices for the organization, this is the one you want to use. Android Enterprise corporate owned with a work profile is the same exact thing, except it does divide them up so that it looks like it's a BYOD Android device. So if you do, I guess now I'm saying that out loud, if you did have a bunch of already Android BYOD guys, and then you actually had corporate owned like Android tablets, then I could see how you may want to use this just so it looked the same as what they're used to. And then the Android open source project, again, is just an alternative to Android Enterprise, because Android Enterprise is a Google product. Android is not. So that is the Android open source variant of it. Going back to the iOS MDM policies and the MDM policies, what if you do have BYOD, but you have people who, for example, are concerned that you may be able to wipe their data, or that you don't have managed IDs in place? Kind of what are your other options here? Because obviously iPhone's a rather large user base within the organization. I think worldwide, I want to say they almost passed 50%, almost. They're getting there. So obviously it's very popular. So what are your options? Well, that's where MAM comes in. So if you recall us describing MAM policies as being your mobile application management policies. So in short, if you are unable to secure the device, what you can do is instead secure the application that's being deployed to that device. So if you're unable to put the walls around the device itself, you can put the walls around your application. So what does that actually look like? So let me get our kind of pause up and I'll kind of show you this. Okay, so these are app protection policies, and this is what is described as MAM. What MAM's really doing is saying, since we can't control your entire device, we're just going to put walls around the apps you install so that our security mechanisms will only really apply to within those applications. Because again, if you're going back to the zero trust model, if we can't protect the device for whatever reason, then what we need to protect is all the other pillars, including the data on it, the applications on it, the user's identity on it. And we were able to do that through these policies. The way these policies actually work is each one of them will have a list of applications that are supported for them. So for example, we go here into the edit on the Android ones. Now, the vast majority of these are going to be all Microsoft ones. Those are the ones that core support this, but there are alternatives. So let me actually show you the list. So for example, on Android side, you have an additional roughly 170 some odd Android applications that do support this. Obviously, your Microsoft products are in here as well. But these are basically the applications that you can get away with doing this for. Because what this is going to do is if they run any of these applications on that device, you're able to define your data protection policies around that device. So what that means is, let's imagine I'm an iPhone user. I don't want the company to be able to wipe my data. I'm not installing MDM. Like my phone's none of y'all's business, but I still want to check my email, maybe access Teams or my OneDrive stuff from my phone. So how do we kind of approach that? Well, if you have a conditional access policy targeted to me that says I can only access my email from a mobile device if it's under an application protection policy, what's going to happen is the first time I fire up my Outlook and it sees that, I'm going to get prompted to install, or that this is a monitored and managed application. And if I'm missing any prerequisites, it's going to ask me to go do that. And if I'm not, it's going to abide by my security requirements that I've defined here before allowing me to access that. And that includes everything from, is the data actually encrypted on that device? Are they allowed to drag stuff out and save it to other locations, such as their own local phone versus other third-party storage locations? So since you have those kind of walls around that application, you kind of see how you're shifting from managing that device to just managing the application and the data and the identity of the person. Because only if they are one of your staff coming in from a device that's mobile, that you are not enrolled, accessing an application under protection policies, that forces the protection of that data on that device. So within this, we have all the different kind of options you have, everything from sending or to other application. I'm sorry, sending or data to other applications. This is basically like, can they copy and paste something between one app to another? If I click on a phone number within my like email, for example, can it call actually like use the dialer app, or am I just going to block that completely? Because you can get that rather granular with it. Now, there are certain differences between iPhone and Android, but they're not nearly as dramatic as the MDM differences. Most of the differences are going to be relatively minor. It's going to be things such as application protection policies can control the copy paste on the Android side, but they can't control it on the iPhone side. So you can, for example, screenshot would be another good one. On the iPhone side, you cannot disable the ability to take a screenshot. On the Android side, you can. Now, any person could just stand back a couple feet with another camera and take a picture of it. So it's not a huge deal, but just know there are small little differences like that. So don't think that they're completely the same. Having said that, this administratively is infinitely easier to maintain, roll out, deploy than your MDMs that will require the managed ID, Apple Business Managers, and quite more excessive prerequisites to roll out. So we're kind of going over here through the data protection policies. This one's currently targeted to iPhones. So we can, for example, exempt certain ones. So that if you do have an app, for example, that will not abide by this, but they do need access to company data, you can exempt that from that, and they'll be able to transfer data from one to the other. But you can kind of see here, what are we allowed to receive apps with? Third-party keyboards we allow them. Do we encrypt our OR data? This one's super important. Obviously, don't allow the device to be jailbroken. Because at the end of the day, that's really what we're doing, is we're trying to protect the actual data at that point. So you can see here all of our different policies of what they can and can't do. And then we have here for access requirements. So this is very similar to kind of our conditional access, but this is, what does that device have to be for us to even trust it? So it's going to be things like it can't be jailbroken, or that they have to use a PIN number or their biometrics to access that application. Because another kind of concern people will have with these kind of strict security policies are things like MFA exhaustion, which is a very real thing, especially if your MFA policies aren't designed halfway decent. So by using these access requirements, you can remove the requirement for, let's say, MFA, because their devices already have a PIN number on it. You can use their face, for example, or their thumb on an Android side to unlock the device, and how long they're allowed to access that application based on that phone, or based on that face or that pin or that finger. So that's generally the idea. As you can kind of imagine, with every use case in your environment, you're going to have different people needing different things, and establishing a standard with the organization is somewhat critical. Informing your users are critical, but what solution you use is also very, very important. So just to kind of summarize all of this, get your actual needs of your organization down, get what you currently have in place. Because if you already have Apple Business Manager, you already have managed IDs, then user-based enrollment, and you already have your familiar VPP tokens, user-based enrollment may be perfectly fine for you. Having said that, if you don't have any of that, and you just have users who want to access their Teams, mail, like other O365 services within your environment, and you don't either have the staff, the bandwidth, or the capability to manage such a thing, put them on an app protection policy, because the data that's put on their phone will be encrypted. They can't jailbreak their phone, will cut all the access off and delete the data. You have the ability to remotely remove that data without actually risking wiping their entire device. In terms of enrollment, there is negatives, however, because there's no free lunch in the world. So we kind of went over the negatives around the iPhone side, remote wipe devicing, needing an actual cable, needing Apple Business Manager, and whatnot. We've gone over kind of the negatives on the Android side, in terms of when to use kiosk, when to use fully managed, when to use work profile. So what are the actual negatives around app protection policies and MAM? The two main ones are that you're going to need a broker app. And what that means is that there's another application that has to be installed that acts as the middle person for application protection policies to function. Now, on the Android side, this is company portal, and it automatically installs itself and sets itself up if they slam into a protection policy ask. On the iOS side, oddly enough, it's the Microsoft Authenticator app. So if you're already down the road in rolling out Azure AD MFA and you already have Microsoft Authenticator on your iOS devices within your environment, you're already about 80%, 70% way there being able to roll out your application protection policies, because you'll roll them out to your users, deploy conditional access, basically forcing them to have application protection policies or they don't get access. And that will prompt their side to say, we have to install this or have to use this. And if it's already there, they'll just get configured and not notice. Except now they have to either use their face to unlock their phone to unlock their Outlook if they haven't done it in a while. But other than that, they shouldn't really notice. And it's much easier in terms of management of staff. No MDM resets, and you can have individual policies obviously scoped to different people, but it is significantly less administrative burden than some of these others, especially on the iOS side, because these user and device enrollments can get hairy very quickly. Android's not as bad, but it's just not as bad. I do want to iterate. I cannot stress enough. Have one of these solutions in place in your environment. It's way too easy to take a non-jailbroken phone and log in, or root an Android device and log in and start doing SSL hijacking, and it's not fun. Protect your data, protect your applications, protect your devices. If devices aren't yours, you can't protect them. Then protect the data and the applications within them. Let me run y'all through the conditional access piece of this, because you might be wondering, okay, that's neat and all, but how do I actually roll that out? That's actually the beauty of it. You roll that out through your conditional access policies. So if, for example, I come back up here and let's just go to our conditional access policies, and I'll show you one that I'm using to trigger this. So if, for example, we go to our conditional access and our policies, and then we will have our protection policy, BYOD. Okay, so this is currently targeted to all of our cloud apps that support it. But in order to actually kind of roll this out, all we'll do here is under the conditions of who will trip this, we'll mark it as Android and iOS for those devices. And then in terms of access control, the only way that they're getting in is by requiring that protection policy. That's it. Anybody scoped to this policy, assuming you have a policy created within your Intune apps and they are scoped to people, all you'll need after that is conditional access saying require it, because what will happen is they'll fire up their device, go to fire up Outlook, Teams, and it will immediately prompt that there's an app protection policy on this application. You either need this broker app so you can access it, or if you already have one, they'll just ask for your fingerprint or your PIN or your face, depending on which one you're using to currently unlock your phone. And that's it. It's rolled. The snags there, obviously, is if you pull data out, it will delete just that data, but that data is also encrypted. Additionally, when their access is cut off, they are immediately cut off because it does do that check against zero trust every single time. So it makes it a very nice little setup where you're still under that zero trust model. And you're still technically trying to protect the device, but really you're not really, because it's a BYOD. So your concern isn't the device at that point. It's the identity, the application, and the data that's contained within. So long as you can kind of put a wall around that, then you're still abiding by zero trust. So that's how kind of MAM can really solve a lot of the more odd use cases around MDM, because as anyone who's kind of rolled these out on the iOS side knows, it can be not fun at times. We went over the zero trust pillars around users, devices, data, network, application workloads. We broke down the differences between MDM, MAM, and BYOD terminology, including the definitions and benefits of each, the common concerns your end users may have, and then solutions to those end users concern. I do want to touch briefly on those end user stuff now that I've ran through this, as I feel it may be more applicable. So if you recall that we were talking about the invasion of privacy concern around MDM, that's where like a BYOD on user device enrollments or application protection policies are great because there is no actual control. We're just controlling that one app that you use. The main pushback that you may have in terms of getting application protection policies rolled out in your organization, more than likely going to be either senior staff that refuse to use Outlook or other supported mail clients or technical staff or an application that just falls way outside of it, although I'd still argue we should still implement them for protecting company data. The other concerns was loss of control over personal devices. BYOD, that's somewhat of a fair concern since device enrollment allows the wiping of the entire data off the device. Additionally, BYOD, you're also able to just deploy new applications as needed, and that can give your end users kind of an odd feeling when new stuff shows up on their phone they weren't expecting. So MAM's a good policy also for that, since there's not additional elements you're pushing out. It's you want to access your mail, go install Outlook. In terms of user experience, about the same, a little bit easier, I would argue, on the MAM side. Fear of data loss and wipe, we kind of gone over that around the device enrollment on the Apple side. And if it's unsupervised or device enrolled, it will allow you to wipe the entire device. Obviously, for these on the Android side, anything that's not the work profile one will have the ability to wipe all data on that device. The only kind of caveat to that is this just deletes the data within their work profile. So all their stuff is safe. And then lastly, the legal issues such as like after hours work on the iOS side or the Android side with mobile devices, people working after hours, you're easily able to go in your conditional access, set a condition for not after hours to lock them out. This is not a one and done setup. You can absolutely mix and match these. So for example, Android side, you'd have these enrolled for your kiosk devices. You may have these for your end users, but you may have on your iOS side the use of MAM policies instead, either because you don't have Apple Business Manager or any such thing. But you may actually have some that are Apple devices that are company owned, and you don't want to necessarily have your application protection policies there. For those, you'd rather have full control. So you can 100% implement this, all of these, or none of, or any mix and match of these within your environment. Just obviously keep your standards in mind. But the key element here is going to be your actual conditional access policy, because what this determines is what's required for them to gain access. And this is not a all unless you tell it to. This is they need at least one of these. So for example, if we were going to implement that on, let's say, this conditional access policy where I wanted known devices to also be able to access these applications and not necessarily have to require app protection, then I can just say that that device has to be marked as compliant, which means it has to be known, it has to be abiding by our compliance policies. And if it has those things, it does not have to have an app protection policy because it's only one of these is required to grant access. And so that's why this can get super kind of granular and you can kind of shape it around each individual company's use case. You just kind of need to know what services they're accessing, how they're accessing them. Are they company-owned devices? If so, what kind? Are they BYOD? And if so, what do you have in place already that would kind of jumpstart you towards BYOD? Certain enrollment types, such as do you already have Apple Business Manager? Are you already using VPP tokens? Are you familiar with it? Because if you're not, and at the end of the day, you've got a couple dozen people just needing access to basic services, and you need to secure that data and those devices around bad actors, throw an application protection policy on it, especially if you're in the middle of still rolling out your known and trusted devices. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of how you can stack all of this up within that zero trust model to basically say that you are either using something that's known and trusted and compliant to our standards, or we're putting little walls around it and you can run an app that can access that data, but that data can't leave those walls. And you can run on any device you want, but it's not going to leave those walls. And that's kind of the way to look at it in terms of MDM versus MAM versus zero trust and how it all kind of flows together.